So as you can see, we have a panel here of invited speakers. This is going to be ably facilitated by Helen, Maher, Vice President for Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. So on our panel we have Dr. Seamus Mathuna, Secretary for Academic Affairs from 1992 to 2010. I hope I have these dates correct. And Secretary from 1993 to 2011. We have Dr. Seamus O'Grady, Director for Adult and Continuing Education from 1978 to 2012. We have Imelda Byrne, Access Officer from 1999 to 2019, and now Head of the Access Centre. And we have Anne O'Brien, Director for Minute Access Programmes from 1998 to 2012. I hope I have all these dates right, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thanks a million, and if we can have a round of applause before we start.
So thank you all. So my job is to draw the wisdom, I suppose, from our panel members in terms of capturing some of that experience over the last 25 years. And I suppose in the role that we have here, or I have in the university in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, this is actually the route that I started in terms of the journey towards equality in higher education, was supporting access. So my first teaching was with a group of women in Waterford and Wexford who had set up a group called Access 2000 in the late 1990s to ask that higher education would respond to their educational needs. Many left school early, lone parents, etc. So I learned how to teach by being, I suppose, taught by women who worked in community organisations of the value that education could bring. I know you've had a lot of the stories, and for me what I've seen is just transformational journeys in terms of that. And to be part of that transformation is such a privilege, because it doesn't just transform the student, it actually transforms you in terms of your engagement with that student, I think, and that process. So now we're going to look at it from a different angle. I know you've had that direct input in terms of that transformational journey and the stories that brings with it. But what does it look like from the institution setting up Access 25 years ago in that space? And I'm going to, maybe I'll lean across the panel this way, so I'll start with yourself, Seamus. So what did it look like at the very start?
Well, I suppose the main thing to be conscious of is that Access here, the Access programme, wasn't an overnight growth, as it were. Since 1950, the university had an adult education program of sorts, but I suppose I was just saying there that Access here isn't an overnight phenomenon. The university itself had a tradition of outreach to the community at large. I suppose originally starting in 1950 with one kind of adult education program, but especially in from the 1970s onward, we offered various programs, diploma in social action and so on, in various rural towns particularly. And that went on, people like Chris Curtin and so on, Hubert McDermott, Garrett O'Toole and so on. All of those were very kind of important leaders in that area under the guidance of Pádraig McDiarmid, who was our director of extramural, I suppose, activities at that stage. And we went on then to develop programs in community development. And I suppose all of us at that stage had, by and large, come from rural towns and so on in Connacht and Clare, by and large. So we always felt somehow that the university experience was something to be shared with the community. We knew ourselves, the places from which we had come, and in a sense we felt an obligation to involve them, or to spread, if you like, the opportunities that we had as students, because at that time, there wasn't the same level of provision for access by students to university. The whole SUSI grant scheme and so on was still some ways away. But our outreach also wasn't just within, it was mainly, I suppose, various towns throughout Connacht, Roscommon, Mayo, Sligo, Clare were, I suppose, particularly prominent, but also outside of the state itself. In the 1980s onwards, we had a program in community development with the Rural College in Draperstown in Derry. And we also indeed went on to develop similar kinds of programs internationally. We had, for example, a diploma in community development practice in Pretoria in South Africa at the time of the transition from the, when the Afrikaner population kind of were finally being joined in power by the native black African population. And we also had courses of that kind going in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia at a time when they were just entering the European Union. And indeed we had one later on in Kosovo at a time with a peacekeeping focus. And indeed we had one also in Bilbao, I remember, involved in sort of equality studies involved with SIPTU at the time. So in a sense there was all that tradition, and which, if you like, provided a fertile ground for access, because the primary motivation behind all of this was the sort of impulse of generosity, that we needed to share what we had with the communities at large. Now, at that stage, by and large, okay, there were some evening BA programs going, but the focus, I suppose, was on reaching out and providing opportunities outside, whereas then the development of access was more or less bringing people in, and not just bringing them in, because it's easy enough to, numbers of institutions at the time had offered places to non-traditional groups of students, but had more or less left them to sink or swim, whereas the whole access concept was a recognition of the real difficulties, the obstacles in place for students like that, and not just in preparing them for the first time entry, but also kind of being there to support them throughout their period of activity.
And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I think it's the critical way to look at it, that access is not just about opportunity. Actually, the measure of success is the supports that you give to students, recognizing that it's a different experience. People are coming from a different background and a different context. If I could go to Anne and ask you what your reflections are in terms of the 25 years of access, maybe going back to a starting point as well, and what you recall from that, and what now, thinking about it, looking back.
Well, I suppose I was appointed in Maynooth in 1998, and it was me, a bit like Imelda. It was Imelda, and then it was me in Maynooth. So, I mean, it was really interesting. I had been working in educational disadvantage with the vocational training opportunity scheme and various other things, but this was a whole new environment in a university, and they had been, I suppose, they had bought into it, like they all had to at that point, after the government had kind of said, you better look at this and whatever. So, I remember saying to the registrar, how do you want me to do this? And I was responsible for disability as well. And he said, you're the expert. So I fled. I went back up to my room on the 3rd floor, which was not accessible to anyone. And I remember looking at the wall and thinking, like, I'm an expert. I'm now an expert. I'm an expert in a university. That's even more scary. But I think, there had been, there were students in. When I came in, there was, in September, there were 10 students in, and there was 10 disability students as well. So I had my little bunch of students, right? I had my office, right? And I had, I suppose, the goodwill of the university. But I think it wasn't simply about the goodwill of the university. What happened and what we did was, we met one another. We had all been appointed by 1999. Imelda was second last, I think, wasn't it? Cork were after you, so kind of by 1999 there was 8 of us. There was 7 universities and DIT, and we met and we were like-minded. We all liked each other. You see, that made a huge difference. We all knew, I suppose, that we were committed to making this work, and that we could do it together, maybe more than, I mean, we had allies and support within the institutions, but together as a group. And so, you know, we were all doing the same things, but we were all doing it in little silos, you know. So I was working with schools kind of West Dublin and Maynooth, and Kildare and Donegal, funnily enough. And then, you know, UCD were working with, you know, outer Dublin. So we were all doing it, and we were bringing in the students individually to our institutions from our link schools, okay? So when we were then, you know, together, we were kind of, where we'd ring each other up and say, look, this student didn't get, you know, I have a good student here from a link school. They didn't get the 4, maybe honours or whatever, but there's only 3 required in Maynooth for going into science. Can you help? So that was the beginning of here, believe it or not. You know, it was that smaller kind of flexible, personal relationship between us working in the universities, and then, I suppose, challenging admissions to kind of say, you know, take this student. Now, when I was started in Maynooth, there was 3,500 students there. You know, we're talking about a whole different ball game, you know, so it was completely different. So that began then about how can we work together in terms of creating more opportunity for this cohort of students, and, you know, all students in terms of mature students, disability, and disadvantaged students. And so, you know, we'd maybe be in Limerick at a meeting, and we'd be coming back, those of us would be on the train, and we had brainstorming sessions on the train, and we were like, can you think of what you could do? So it began in a very flexible, organic development, you know, and then it became, as it grew within all of the institutions, and then the students that came to us grew, it developed more into, I suppose, more organised. And that's there then when the beginning of Here and There came. And I was the first chair on that, right? Okay. So the flip side of all of the stuff in terms of working and being with students and working together is fighting the system. Yeah. Right.
Can we pause on that and come back to that? And we won't absolutely lose sight of that, but to give Seamus an opportunity to reflect on your experiences and to maybe look to whether that changed anything in the institution itself from what you observed here in Galway.
Well, I was involved from 1972, and it was largely adult and continuing education. The term access, as we know it now in terms of these programs, didn't exist, but as Seamus earlier said, the concept of access for the community of the region to the resources of the university was central to our thinking. And I just found a few things that Imelda sent to me recently. The first statement in our mission statement for adult and continuing education in 1989 stated that we were committed to the development of the intellectual and creative potential of all citizens in the provision as open as possible of access and educational opportunities for the adult community. So access was a kind of wider spin-off from the adult and continuing education activities. As I said, the concept of an access course didn't exist, and at that time the fighting the resources for the resources in the university is, like Anne said, a big issue for us. When I started, it was just myself and the former director of adult education, and for 3 or 4 years afterwards it was just myself and a half-time administrator in the office, and that gradually grew to 2 people in the office. Later it became more substantial. But on one occasion, back in the late 80s, some ladies from Galway wanted to have a pre-university access type program, and they came and had a chat with me, and I thought it was a good idea. So I put it to the Board of Adult Education, and the reaction was interesting from a few perspectives. The first one being the resources question. At that time, the university had a ranking system for academic departments to get funding based on needs and development and expansion. The funding was so low that it was commonly referred to as the misery index. So we had a discussion at the Board of Adult Education about this access program, and the misery index immediately raised its head because all the people on the board were members of academic staffing departments, and they thought, what is this going to do to the misery index? All the funding was coming from the university, and we're going to go down the ranks if this kind of thing goes on. The second point, which was quite interesting, was an academic point, that an access course was seen as pre-university, and pre-university level activities, which would be classified as level 5 in the academic scale nowadays, or even some level 6 courses, were beneath the status of the university in the view of many people. So there were two kind of principal objections. One was finance, the other was the academic status of the program. But the third was that we didn't actually have any expertise to do a program like that, and it failed to get through. But it did raise consciousness of the need for more active access thinking. And in 1989, I think, in 1996, in our mission statement, we had something similar restated, that the future direction of adult and continuing education should include access courses for second chance students to facilitate progression and participation at certificate, diploma and degree level. So that kind of permeated our thinking until 1997. I think Imelda was the first announcement of the strategic targeted initiatives from the HEA, and of course the important point there for everybody was there was money at the end of the application process. It wasn't going to affect the misery index anymore. So our first bid for application was about 1997 and into 98, and the HEA funding announcement came in January, February for the year 97-98, and that gave us only until September to do anything. So we invented our first access program, which was run over the summer period for 4 months. This was pre-Imelda's time, and it was quite successful. I think there were 11 students on it. I can't remember the outcomes, but I think most of them carried on and got through to degree programs afterwards. Then Imelda joined us, and the whole world was unleashed.
Can we, if you don't mind, Seamus, go to what that world looked like then? What did you unleash at that point?
Well, the HEA funds were unleashed.
Oh yes, okay. Well, let's go to Imelda then anyway, and
just thinking of what Seamus said there, the first group of students, the first group of 11, and I think like 10 of them got through, and one of them being Dr. Hannah McGinley, who was the first Irish traveller to get a PhD from here, you know. So I suppose when I started, I had such support from, you know, the well-established steering committee, with both Seamus and Seamus were a part of. Seamus was my direct line manager, but I felt huge support from the institution, and you know the unique. Seamus always taught me, I suppose, both Seamuses, was that, you know, the University of Galway was unique in its region. We were the only university on the Western Seaboard. And as Seamus Mathuna said earlier about the outreach, and the region was so important to the work at the university. And I learned, I suppose, from my colleagues here about, you know, the geography of disadvantage as well as other types of disadvantage. And from the outset, it wasn't simply about access, it was about people succeeding. So it was really important that our selection process and the supports that we gave those students were key to success. We met regularly as a steering group, and again I was given, I suppose, like Emma said, such freedom. You know, Seamus would say to me, you know, go off to this meeting, go off and meet these people, and that was a huge learning. And there was never anything that was wrong. Everything was an opportunity to learn. So we started off with that pilot course before I arrived, and also for the academic year 98-99, Alma and Rita, who were here earlier, had been employed to deliver the part-time course, and there was again a huge commitment to the region and to the Gaeltacht region, and that's why the Mature Students Access course was based in Connemara, in North Connemara initially, and then into South Connemara, because not only geography but language and the barriers that they had presented to the region were something that the steering committee and Seamus here were really conscious of, and how we could support them to come in and stay in. So again, as Anna said, like, I'd go off, Seamus insisted that I'd go to kind of international conferences and benchmark, because we were at the very beginning and stuff, so we learned a lot from each other, we learned a lot internationally. So it went from a pilot course of 11 students
in 1990, the summer of 98, to taking, like, within a few years we had 40 school leavers on the programme, and we had equal amount of numbers on the mature students programmes. And parallel to that as well, there was an arrangement with GMIT, as it was at the time, to deliver other foundation type programmes for mature students who didn't have to the academic background. It wasn't simply around socio-economic disadvantage. There again, it was the consciousness of not just access but successful participation and successful outcomes. So I learned a lot what was happening nationally. I learned a lot internationally. Every year we applied to the Strategic Innovation Fund, and we were continuously getting money, So I never heard about the misery index actually until now. They never told me that bit.
You tried to project yourself.
And I was talking about misery index, and we'd be spending money, and I'd say to Seamus, I'm going to end up in Mountjoy jail with the way we're spending money here. And Seamus said, don't worry, I'll be well retired by the time that happens. Anyway, I'm still here. Neither of us ended up in Mountjoy jail, and we continued to expand. And again, we were unique in that, Galway and the region was very different, I suppose, to inner city Dublin and Cork and Limerick in terms of areas of disadvantage. There was all the second level schools were one side of the Corrib. So everybody who went to secondary school, and the unique thing as well about Galway was that in terms of, application or eligibility for the School Leavers Access course, was that everybody in any school in the region was able to apply for it, with a particular emphasis, I suppose, on supporting disadvantaged schools. But again, the recognition that simply because you were in a school, in a second level school, that you didn't experience disadvantage was not taken into account. And we had kind of minimum academic eligibility criteria to come onto the programs, and then I'd come back and I'd say, okay, I've met somebody, and this person doesn't have leaving cert. They had other issues. Would we continue taking them out? And progressively we were taking more people who actually didn't even have a leaving cert onto the school leavers course, But as I said, there were such wonderful, visionaries, and I often describe Seamus as saying, like, he did local output, like we provided locally, but we were doing it with a global ambition and global standards in terms of what we were providing. So maybe I did do a lot, Seamus, I don't know, but I had so much support, as I said, internally from people like both Seamuses here, so.
Yeah. And also I think what you were talking about earlier, Anne, is that like-minded people across the sector, so a vision, and everything that you've all said, I suppose, points that there was a vision that was distinctive. I remember not the misery index, but the poor cousin, because there were lots of things we did that weren't conventional in terms of higher education. Our teaching methods, our starting point was that everybody in the room had knowledge, expertise, experience, capacity, intellect, even if they had no leaving cert. And then the methods were very critical, pedagogy. So that philosophy, and I think you've all referred to it, so that underpinning idea. So could you talk or reflect on the philosophy, that, like, why was that an important way of working?
Yes, I suppose I should also mention that some of the other initiatives of an access character, even though, as I say, as we all know, the access programme as such wasn't there at that stage, were in the Gaeltacht areas, where the university established outreach centres in Carrow, Corn, agus Guidord, agus an sin chuidir roint cuasaí ar fáil ón néadú gnóchan mar sin, padamach an numara a bhí taifíordíobh sin ar fad, agus cuasaí a bhí in iruint do riachtan is an phobal. Courses that were geared towards the actual practicalities of the community itself. And I suppose there was a model of community development built into those in that particular area. And all of those initiatives that I talked about earlier from the 70s onwards particularly, the one common feature they all had was the person who initiated them. That was Seamus O'Grady here. He was really the engine behind all of those, with the ideas and the implementation and the ways of working them through the system. because that wasn't always entirely easy either. And the reason I mention that is that in that environment, the crucial thing was the freedom that people were given to develop those ideas, to come up with the ideas and to implement them. And nowadays, one often hears, and obviously we're removed from it, but that there's too much of that the only emphasis really is on, as Pat was saying earlier, on the financial side, and in a certain sense, at a national level and so on, the box-ticking exercises. Make sure you don't take risks, make sure that, we're all protected from any kind of unfortunate things that might happen. But that's very much to the detriment of allowing people to develop things, give them the space, the freedom to develop them. And this is something that I think the university, whether consciously or not, it wasn't perhaps too consciously as such that the freedom was there, but people like Seamus took that freedom and used it and developed initiatives which really, as I was mentioning, even stretched to the international level. And just one other thing I would like to mention is that's perhaps not known too much about. Before the Access program actually started, the university here got a bequest from the Athlone novelist John Broderick, the great novelist of Irish provincial life. And John, in his will in 1988, he died in 1989, and in 1990 the university heard for the first time about this, that he left the university a sum of £40,000 at the time to establish a fund, the income of which would be provided, the income of which would go towards providing assistance to needy students residing in the urban district of Athlone who were attending UCG. There was an extraordinary bequest, if you like, because number one, he had no connection whatever here with the college. He didn't tell us about it. We didn't hear about it until after his death from the solicitors involved. And between various other things, he resided in Bath at the time, so that's where most of his property was. We didn't actually receive the income of that until 2009, because his housekeeper, whom he wanted to make special provision for, because of the downturn of property and so on, really, we agreed, the Arts Council effectively, the will was eventually, if you like, amended. He left 2/3 of it to the Arts Council for arts developments in Athlone Library and things like that, and 1/3 of it to us. And by the time we got it in 2009, the amount was €120,000. So I think we kind of eventually honoured that generosity of his by establishing a little memorial place up outside the bursar's office in the quadrangle, where that there's a corner devoted to that generous gesture, and it's no harm to recall that kind of unique kind of gesture at a time when there was no HEA access program, was still 10 years away.
Thanks so much. I think you brought us on so many journeys in that, and what you reflected on earlier, and that connectivity at global level to then that arts connectivity and the individuals. I'm going to go to Anne to go back to the moment of resistance, of which wasn't a moment. I expect the decades of resistance. That linked back to maybe the philosophy and that way of being and of doing things. So could you reflect on that, if you don't mind?
Well, I suppose, excuse me, I suppose in terms of the university sector, the appointment of access officers was seen as kind of radical to some extent, and I suppose in terms of philosophy, like I knew what my philosophy was in relation to coming to this position, and then it was. See, the university hadn't. Once they said to me I was the expert, it was kind of like, and who believes in this and why and whatever. So I suppose there was it was about building up relationships then within the, for me on a personal level, it was about building up relationships within the university and driving forward then this belief that education should be for everybody, and that can we look at the barriers and how can we here in this university break down the barriers and build up support for students and whatever. And there was of course there was big resistance and not big resistance, and everybody was different, and academics wanted money for research, and interestingly enough they saw me as sitting on a pot of money that they wanted some of, right? And I wasn't giving, I wasn't sharing, not unless it was supportive of what we were trying to do. But I suppose the other thing about Maynooth at that time was it had become a secular university in 1997. So there was two institutions on the campus. So it was new as well, and finding its feet and who it was, as opposed to being St. Patrick's College Maynooth. So that was a new dynamic as well. So in a sense, that made it a little easier for me because it was new. And then in the context of kind of the bigger picture stuff, Maynooth, you see, listening to you talking about Galway, you know, it almost sounds like enviable and easier, you know, but Maynooth is on the fringes of Dublin. Yes. You know, and it was finding its feet in a circular sense. You know, I keep saying circular instead of secular. But anyway, it was finding its feet as a new university. And then there were the bigger, kind of much more influential universities like Trinity and UCD, yes. And DCU was also there, but it was newer. And then DIT. So what, as I said about finding the access officers, we all had a shared philosophy, and so it was just winning allies and finding your people, on, you know, persuading the bursar who held the purse strings that was my money, you know, that was ring-fest for what I wanted to do, and we were doing it, but you know, we weren't sharing it until we knew whatever. And then when it moved on to becoming a bigger, more structural thing like the here and there. So then the resistance was from social welfare, from like all the people who were involved in terms of determining the eligibility of students. It was really, really new for them. And so there was a really huge amount, even the Department of Education, the HEA, social welfare kind of stands out because it was a bigger battle, you know. But it was also bringing these institutions, which were systems of the state, well embedded, had their ways of doing things, didn't want to change. CAO was another one. Sinead is around somewhere here anyway. So, you know, they didn't want to either. Like, so how do you convince big institutions, strong institutions, that we can find ways together to change and whatever. So I suppose the philosophy all the time was, we want to open education, we want to create change, we want everybody on board, and we want it systems-wise and people-wise, and that's really the tension to a certain extent. I would sort of say maybe today. You know, now I think COVID would have had a hard impact on all students, but maybe more particularly the students coming through widening participation. But the tension between the people and the humans and the experiences of people and a system that maybe is becoming rigid and that maybe needs to jig around a bit and whatever, because we have created that system now. But I think the philosophy driving it all the time is that it's about people, it's about education and offering education at the right time for the right people when they need it. I suppose that's what we hope.
Great, thanks, Anne. You've gone through so many different layers there, from the internal and then the external challenges as well. Seamus, to ask you, what do you think from the experience you've had, what has made it work well, do you think?
I think our rootedness in the general region which we were attempting to serve was a big help, because from 1969 onwards our adult education programme was outreaching across Connacht, Clare and Donegal, so we were running courses in Carndonagh, North Donegal, at the same time as we were running courses in Kilrush in County Clare and everywhere in between. So we had a huge connection to the local VEC committees and to local community and voluntary organisations. So we always saw ourselves as a regional university, which brought up an interesting point in the early days of the Access funding. The first pilot run on Access, as I recall it, was Ballymun with the Dublin City University, and they ran what was called the BITE initiative, the Ballymun Initiative for Tertiary Education. And the Secretary General of the Department of Education was very impressed by this, and the first announcements about Access kind of implied that we were all going to deal with the Ballymuns of our region. So there was a real battle on our hands to convince the funders that our work was Connacht, Clare and Donegal, and subsequently the whole BMW region, which was about 2/3 of the landmass of the country, with the population of 1 million in the whole spread, as compared to the Ballymun initiative, which probably had 500,000 within a 5-mile radius of the campus. So these kind of challenges came to the fore, and it took a meeting between the Vice President and myself with the HGA in Dublin after they reduced our funding in the early stages, to explain to them that we had a different mission to the Dublin City University, and that we wanted to serve the community of our region as comprehensively as we could, despite its geographic spread. So I think that connection to the region was a big part, and in setting up subsequently out of the BMW regional announcements, we set up a higher education network, which Anne and Maynooth and all the higher education institutions within the BMW region participated, and we established a basis for outreach to places that we hadn't been very much before, Tullamore and Ballinasloe and Portlaoise, and there was one in Louth, and I think we did one at the edge of Dublin. There was a number of outreach courses which continued because of the new BMW partnership that was created. So I think largely our connections to the region was the single biggest factor in getting the thing moving very easily.
Yeah. You describe it so well in terms of really understanding that for this to work, it couldn't possibly be a one-size-fits-all model, that it had to be responsive to your own regional and local context, because really this is about starting where people are at, isn't it? And I think, Anne, you've talked about that as well. To bring us forward to some of the changes, I suppose, Imelda, you've witnessed lots of changes at that, higher education authority level. Then there's a lot of pathways now. All of the panelists have mentioned different elements of the supports, and you have here and there, you have the kind of everything under DEFRAS now with further and higher education, so that transition emphasis. So has that made a difference, do you think, those type of pathways and initiative?
Absolutely. As I said, 25 years ago, the only route for people was in Galway was through the Access course route, and again it was unique in terms of what everybody has described here, both Seamuses, in terms of what we wanted to do for the people on our doorsteps and in the region. Subsequently, we became a part of the HEAR scheme. I think we were probably last to join it, and the HEAR and DARE scheme. And we went from having small numbers on Access courses to massification, nearly going from 0 of the pilot scheme of HEAR into medicine, I think, to from 10 to 200 the following year. So the pathways, as I said, definitely have given loads more opportunities, and I think for people in the region and the schools and for mature students, knowing that those pathways exist is great for them. But I mean, again, I suppose we heard the 4 students here today. It's 2024, and the challenges that they have. Like 25 years ago, it was like lack of money that prevented people from getting that chance to go to higher education. From simply today, the complexities of individual challenges, family challenges, homelessness, addiction, and so on. We're dealing with people that have really complex issues. So yes, we have many more pathways, but we need many more supports for the students, you know, and I suppose we're fortunate here in the university that we've just recently appointed a social worker, which is great, but we need more, you know, and the disability support team is very broad. We have occupational therapists, we have psychologists. Again, you know, we're keeping pace, I suppose, with somewhat in recognising what the challenges are for the society that we now live in. But as I said, you know, I think I don't know who posed the question this morning, was it the President or you, Pat, around, you know, we're kind of reflecting back, but I mean, going forward, I think, yes, we have the pathways, but I think we need a huge amount of resources in terms of belonging, sense of belonging for all students, but particularly for the students that we target through our pathways, you know, so yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's just also making me remember some of the work that I did in Oncasan in Tala Women's Community Organisation, and what was required, the one-to-one support that was required for those students to stay the course because of all of those wider, not just personal, but societal contexts that were so challenging in their community environment. I'm just thinking, does anybody want to ask a question from the floor? We can maybe share the mic. I'll happily bring up the mic. But just conscious that, you know, I've had the privilege of drawing on ye, and just before we come to an end, and remind me of the timing, we're nearly at that point. So would you like to say something else, Seamus? Yeah.
Could I just say that, as was, I was singing Seamus's praises earlier, but with Imelda was, I'd just like to pay a special tribute to her effort in our time here, because again, I was on the Access Committee, of course, which was chaired by Professor Ruth Curtis at the time, who is abroad at the moment, so can't be here today, and she was Vice President for Development and External Affairs. But the detail with which we always heard about these particular students with their problems, I mean, it kind of reminded me so much of all the wonderful stories we had heard today. But even from the very beginning, Imelda had that detailed interaction with every individual student, the sorts of problems unearthed and identified, which really required a lot of time on her part to delve into and work out. And I suppose we were talking, or people were talking earlier about the individual, and indeed yourself, Helen, too, about the individual return. But it was also a communal return, because the really kind of gratifying aspect of a lot of these access programs was people, adults especially, who had never had a chance even to go to second level, coming here, doing the access program, getting first-class honours degrees, going back going back into their communities to teach. In other words, terrific role models for their society. And just maybe finally, I might mention, because I see Mary Surlis up here at the top, we had a wonderful, another initiative called Living Scenes at the time, which again was under Seamus's auspices here, and it was involvement involving transitional year students with active retired associations in joint ventures of, you know, drama, poetry, so on. And the key thing was the interaction between generationals. It was an intergenerational program, which the President of Ireland honoured by inviting them up to. So again, that was an example of a different kind of outreach to the community at a generational level.
That's right. Thanks, Seamus. I think you've just, again, illuminated so many different aspects of it, and that, I think, incredible commitment is what's coming through, and vision, and just will that all of the relationships were central to that, and that you know, seeing this through to succeed in the way that it has, that doesn't just impact on the individual. I think we all know and see that it has a whole of community impact, a family impact. So with that, is there any questions from the audience? And I know Cormac has the mic up there, so. And as Cormac engages in some light jogging around,
Thanks a million. I hope everyone can hear me, and I just want to say
thank you so much for that. I could probably listen to this for a few hours. Myself and Pat were just saying, was this being recorded? Which it is as well, so if anybody wants to watch it after. I suppose the question I have is a question for all of you. You're really involved in producing huge amounts of social change within the institution, which reverberates outside. And I just wonder, when it came to trying to convince or persuade colleagues within the university to go with you on this journey, were you appealing to their moral commitment to the ideal? Was it money, resources? Was it research? I know, and we spoke last night about Patrick Clancy's research, for example. Were those kind of conversations taking place? What was the thing that you could rest your hat on and say, this is the thing that will convince people to go with me on this?
Trick you could think of, I think. Anything you could pull out of the bag. I think, I mean, first of all, it was about getting to know people and seeing where they were at, to a large extent. Money was, you know, they wanted my money. You know, it wasn't my money, but they wanted my money. You know, so, but I wanted some back. So it was a kind of a business relationship too. I think one of the things, if you think about it, you see, I was responsible at that time for, I had a bigger remit in that I was responsible for students with disability as well, right? So one of the things I did at the beginning was I got a group of academics in and I gave them a test around dyslexia, reading a document that was written, that would look like what an ordinary document would look like for a student who had dyslexia, right? Now, it was one of the most, it was slightly terrifying, you know, because it was a bit, I was pushing the boundaries a little bit here. But also, what I wanted people to understand was what we were trying to do for all of the students was make their lives better. And one of the things was, and by the way, you know, they were very competitive because they were academics and they were doing all sorts of things like looking at it, because they couldn't interpret it, and they were looking at each other and everything. It was hilarious to watch, right? But what it did was, it got them talking about the challenge of just breaking down this piece of paper, okay? And basically that's all I wanted, was people to talk to each other and appeal to their better nature, really, if you like. So, like, if this is hard, how is it like for a student coming in here, and the kind of language you use, you know, all sorts of things. So I think I would have hoped that within the university that there was a collective social conscience, but you kind of had to drill it out. And then, you know, it was interesting. I think, Imelda, you would have had, like, we would have talked about this. And I mean, I remember sometimes I found that younger academics were much more resistant, you know, and people who come through the system unscathed and end up working in academia have low tolerance of people who do not achieve academically and don't understand the challenges, you know. So a lot of it was about working with people and sort of saying, you know, a student, like, one of the good examples of it is a student came to me one day and said that the business lecturer was talking about getting the Irish Times, that they should read the article on business in the Irish Times, and this young person didn't know what the Irish Times was, right? And he, you know, he said to me, really frankly, is we get, I forget which paper he said, and it's just opened at sports pages, right? So, like, that's a big cultural bit, right? And so my role in terms of that bit was to bring it into the academic norm and say, careful, you know, think. And that's hard for people who are, you know, really expert in their subject matter, and they might, you know, kind of feel that I was asking them to dumb down their stuff. So there were, in terms of just the academic community, there were challenges around how they saw themselves and the university and standards and an interloper, maybe, you know, coming in and whatever. But I think at the end of the day, again, like I said earlier, it's about human nature. I would really believe most people are kind. Most people believe in other people. And it was really about just saying, you know, everybody has capacity to learn. And how do we open the doors to that capacity, and how do we help them to because once students got the feel of it, got the hang of it, they flew, you know, and that in itself was the big changer. Once the first cohorts came through, I didn't need to do any, you know, they did it for me, you know. So I suppose essentially money was only a background thing, you know. I think it was more about people are good, and it's about appealing to that in their busy lives, as just saying, can you do more? Because it's a little bit about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
To Seamus's answer, I'd say I think I was very naive, because I just thought everybody would do it because it was the right thing to do. But also I think because I had such a supportive manager and a supportive committee, I'm sure both Seamuses fought battles with people that I didn't have to. I was the operator, I was just getting on with meeting the students and all the rest, you know. But I think I was naive, and I think when both Seamuses retired, I learned really about how much they had done, and I had to start doing it then, you know. So yeah, I just thought everybody was like them, and that it was the right thing to do. But I'm sure both Seamuses have different experiences.
Well, as I said in the earlier comment, the college was well adjusted to doing outreach, and the form of access that we best knew for about 25 years before the access program came into consideration. There was a core of academics in the key departments that were interested and supportive, even though staffing was always a bit of an issue for us. But we were lucky because they allocated part-time people who were working with them to do some of the work with us. And I might say that we had a very receptive bursar at the time, even though the financial meetings every year were not as free and easy as they might have been. The bursar generally acknowledged that she believed in what we were doing, and that she did continue to increase budgets for the core office staff and for some of the activities. So the misery index was no longer in question.
Always good to lose the misery index.
Mel was just saying there that she was naive. Well, all I can say is thank God for naivety. But I suppose certainly I think it was very much that spirit that I was referring to earlier on, about the spirit of generosity. And because back in the 70s and so on, there were people going driving at night time, coming back all hours of the night, places like Belmullet, Castlereagh, Kilrush and so on. And I suppose they did that, but they themselves were enriched by that interaction with the local people too. Even our historians who would go out giving maybe particular lectures on topics and so on, where they were giving lectures to people who perhaps knew more about the history of the locality than themselves. So it was a mutually enriching process, I think.
Great. Thanks, Seamus. So I know, just on time, have we time for that one last question? Ananda had her hand up, or will we? I'll be guided by Imelda. Yeah, it is, for sure. Thanks, Ananda.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just really inspired by this discussion and the reflection and the looking back, and how, as you said, and those battles, you know, how do you convince large embedded institutions to change? My role is in first year transitions, and it's a new role, and I suppose I'm very interested because that is almost the next step after access. It's the transition for the first years, and then eventually, hopefully, progression and success for them. So I guess my question is, I was really struck by all of the mentions of community and belonging when the students were speaking, how important that sense of family they mentioned, the sense of community. And then in this discussion, I was inspired by the vision, you know, how in dealing with these large embedded institutions, and you were talking about state institutions, and I can draw correlations with our own institutions. It's complex, there's a lot of systems, and that tension between the human experience. So I think that all relates to the transition experience as well. So my question is really, what's arising here is back to that vision and that philosophy and we're in the process of creating a new university strategy, and belonging is coming up. So my question is really about your thoughts about that, maybe as a guiding vision or philosophy, or for me, myself, it's this idea of a learning community. And is there a way, I don't know, your thoughts on how we can progress this in this complex system where there's a tension between the human experience?
So that was an easy question to end on, I'd say. But fascinating, and I'll just throw it open and see it, and maybe distilling that, despite all the complexity, that creating the community of learning and belonging, how do we do that now into the future?
You have to keep thinking about people. I think, now I'm retired 12 years, but I still kind of keep in touch with what's happening and whatever. But certainly it seems that the world, the world has changed dramatically in that 12 years in terms of technology. And the word remote has been used a bit. And I was in Maynooth two weeks ago for the Maynooth 25th anniversary. And, they were talking about Zoom and remoteness. And whereas I think this is about people. It's about people. So as well as the advantages and the benefits that technology brings, it's about remembering that this is about people. And no matter what model is being applied, because it's very obvious listening. The Galway model is very different to the kind of model I was working in, but it's at the bottom line is the same, and the benefits and the supports and the help and whatever you want to call it for students who come in through widening participation are equally relevant for any student coming in. I mean, I think most students struggle with the transition into higher education because it's so different and it's self-directed learning. And then they hopefully, with the right everything, that they fit academically, they've picked the right things and they get the kind of supports that they need, that they emerge as independent learners or researchers or teachers, but that they are independent in their learning, and that then they can bring that into whatever area of life that they go and work. So it's all about people, but we need the qualitative, the quantitative, we need all of that stuff, all that data, because when we began, there was very little data. We had Paddy Clancy's research on it was on postcodes, really, wasn't it? The whole thing was based on postcodes and entry to higher education, and that's what our work was based on in the beginning. Now we have the wealth of all of the kind of research that you've done, and the report we did today, and many others, and there are many more questions in terms of the future and how to find things out and what can we do better and improve. But it's all about people.
Thanks.
At the end of the day.
Thanks for that. Imelda, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I saw Kelly was here earlier as well, and again, I think if we take access as an example, that, and Seamus spoke earlier about kind of the level of detail I knew and that my colleagues know about students. And at the event we were at last night, one of the lads who was speaking, said about a recent conversation I had with him and about coming away from it, that he always knew I believed in him. So people having that connection with you and Andy maybe, or we need more student advisors, that they have somebody that they can go for a cup of coffee with, or whatever. And also I'm hoping, and I see my colleague Deirdre up there in the corner as well, that we're moving towards the whole area of universal design, and universal design in teaching and learning as well, and that hopefully that would create systems that makes everybody feel included. I mean, and there's only one of you, for 3,000 students, like when you think of it, so it's about us working better together maybe as well, learning from best practice that we have, maybe adapting some of the stuff that we have done. But again, if we go back to the 4 students that spoke today, it was about somebody believing in them, you know, so.
Okay, so maybe we'll end on the point of somebody believing in you. I think there's just something at the heart of all of this. So I just want to thank you so much to Seamus and Anne and Seamus and Imelda for sharing those insights. And if this is not all written down somewhere and recorded, please somebody take on this work of researching and documenting, and because let's never lose that knowledge. And because I know earlier it was student stories, but this is a much bigger story, bringing in all of those student stories as well. And I think let's not lose all that learning and all of those amazing initiatives that you've each referred to. So thank you for your input. Thank you everybody for being patient with our timing.
Moderating today, and oh god, sorry, there's that gone. And again to my former colleagues, and both here in the university and Anne from Mathuna, and all my colleagues that are here today. You've all been on the journey as well, and we've lunch now if people want to come to Sult, and we have an alumni gathering tomorrow where I think over 200 students are coming back, where we celebrate them and all their achievements. But there's a lot of people here that prepared, you know, for the last few months, yesterday and today and tomorrow, and I really want to thank you. There's a team involved. We met every week, and some new staff that really took it on board, you know. So again, just to thank you all very sincerely, and as I won't be here for the next 25 years, you know, and just you know, to wish all my colleagues the best for the future as well. And I know access and the widening participation is in such safe hands with all my colleagues here at the university. And thank you, Helen, again, and thanks to Pat as well. Thank you. Thank you.